My mother was 16 years old when she got married and had the first of my older brothers. My older brothers were definitely baby boomers. And because my mother was young when she had them, her parents and my dad's parents treated her like she didn't know what she was doing. So, of course, they had to take charge. So, my brothers were largely raised by the two sets of grandparents and all of the aunts and uncles on both sides. And so that shaped my brothers and how they grew up and the culture that they had. Their culture was basically the culture of their grandparents. And as they got older, they were always in trouble. They were spanked, and they were in and out of jail, and they were always in trouble at school. They were hell raisers, and they were always working on cars, and there were always cars that were half taken apart in the driveway. But they were often stealing cars, or they were dealing drugs, or they were doing something. They were always, like I said, they were in and out of jail, and they were always in trouble. And they didn't graduate from high school. They were dropouts. And they, of course, at the time, they were hippies. They all were very much in that whole thing at the time in the 60s. And there was a lot of time in between my brothers and when I was born. My mom got pregnant 3 separate times after my brothers, and those babies didn't make it. 3 separate times. So there was almost a decade between my brothers and myself. They were boomers, and I was Generation X. And so they were so much older than I was that they weren't like brothers. They were more like uncles. And when I was still young, they all moved out. They moved on with their lives. They grew up and went on and did things. But I was raised very, very differently. And it's like my mom saw how they turned out. She looked at who had raised them, how they had raised them, and how they had turned out. She saw all that by the time I was born. And so she made some very firm decisions, some very different decisions. For one thing, she raised me with the decisions that she made with no input. In fact, she banned the grandparents from coming around so that they would have no influence whatsoever. I didn't know my grandparents, and I didn't know my aunts and uncles. I never saw them when I was growing up. My mom raised me in an environment of classical music and art. I was playing instruments. We were always watching documentaries, learning about history. If we watched a movie, it was an old movie, one of the classics. Exposed not just to classic movies, but classic literature. So a lot of Charles Dickens, Treasure Island, the classics. And we had a room that my brothers did not have growing up. We had a library, and this library also doubled as a playroom. And in this room, we had all these books on science and literature and history and nature. And when we were younger, of course, the room was full of blocks and Legos and you name it, anything educational, and we had it in there. And she had a radio that was permanently tuned to the classical music station, so that when we were in the playroom, we just heard classical music, and that was just always on. And I don't know if this affected everything, but it sure seems like it probably did, because then, when I went to school later, I turned out to be a genius. And I think that being a genius wasn't so much a matter of being made smarter as much as being allowed to be myself and not being suppressed or squelched or prevented from just developing naturally. I had no interest in cars whatsoever. Did not care about the make and model of a car. I honestly never touched a car and never had any desire to. I was always drawing as a kid. I was very quiet. I was either reading or drawing, playing with my toys when I was young. And that's pretty much all. And I went on to be extremely creative and, of course, had a life of art and music and literature and so on. But it was funny that there was such a difference between my brothers and myself. We had trouble relating to each other. They were just, to me, they were just incredibly alien. They didn't have anything in common with me. And vice versa. They would often say that it was as if we had been raised by two completely different sets of parents, that the parents who raised me were not the same as the parents who raised them, which in a lot of ways was true. We didn't have the same values, we didn't have the same interests, and we didn't remember the same kinds of things about the world. So it was very, very interesting. Well, I'll end the video here. Okay, bye-bye.